Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Greg Nichols, a subject matter expert with the Homeland Defense and Security Information Analysis Center. I want to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon on wearable technology for physiological monitoring in the DoD. We have a special guest today, and I will introduce her momentarily. But first, just a few things on housekeeping here. We will have the chat function enabled. You can chat throughout the webinar, but we will be holding any responses to those questions until the end. Both Glory and I will be available for answering any of those questions. Probably most of those will be directed towards her and her research, but I'll be happy to take any questions as well. So just a few things. First, I just want to give you a brief introduction on HDIAC, who we are, what we do. Many of you have joined us before for our monthly webinars. We are a Department of Defense sponsored organization. Organizationally, we sit within the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. Administratively, we report to the Defense Technical Information Center. This is actually reflective of our mission. As you can see, we provide authoritative responsive solutions by generating and acquiring, analyzing, and disseminating information analysis to our customers. We do this through a variety of different means, but it helps us support research and development efforts within the Department of Defense and the federal government at large. A couple other things I want to mention before we get started. Our guest is a subject matter expert that we have recruited into our network, and we do have an extensive network of subject matter experts across all of our focus areas. We have a variety of support that we provide DoD and other agencies. We do have some in-house expertise, but we have a fairly small staff, so we do rely on the support of our partners and our subject matter experts. So if you are interested in joining us, if you have an expertise in one of our 8 areas, please go to our website to find out more information, or you can contact me directly at the end of the webinar. We'll have my contact information listed. All right, so why this topic, why now? Well, there's 3 different reasons I think this is an important thing to mention. So first of all, as many of you are aware, wearable technologies is becoming quite an overwhelming sort of thing. We have a variety of different types. Many of us have used or are familiar with things like Fitbits, Apple Watches, Galaxy Gear. We have some emerging things such as the Google Glass, the eyeglasses that are connected to the internet, as well as things like earbuds that can translate languages in real time. We also have a number of advanced technologies that are starting to become indoctrinated into everyday items. Smart tattoos are now being used to monitor glucose in diabetic patients. We also have smart textiles and fabrics being used in clothing and shoes, most notably companies like Under Armour incorporating these technologies into athletic gear to monitor the performance of athletes. Also, we have a huge interest in DoD in terms of how these wearables can be used to monitor human performance and health within active duty soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen. We have a lot of information that's come from Edgewood Chemical Biological Center in terms of how wearables can be incorporated into military operations, and as we will hear today, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency is also interested in terms of how these wearables can be used for exposure monitoring and other types of applications. We also have a huge investment of DoD into components that would go into these wearable technologies. So for example, flexible electronics. In 2015, DoD announced that they would be investing $75 million into Netflix, which is a consortium of industry, academia, and government agencies, primarily DoD, to advance the development of flexible electronics. And also an investment in smart textiles and fibers, looking at the Advanced Functional Fabrics of America, which is led by MIT, and DoD has announced that they're going to invest another $75 million into that endeavor. It's been predicted that we're going to see 200 million wearable devices shipped annually, somewhere by 2021. So it's going to be a huge amount of data collected, and also that opens up some other issues that most of you have probably been aware of recently, but some of the security issues that may be associated with wearable devices. Recently, there was a company called Strava, which posted a heat map of its subscribers who were using these fitness trackers, and that also included some active duty military members, which opened up some sensitivities to base locations. So these are things that we need to consider, and some things that we will bring up on the phone or on the webinar today. And with that, I want to introduce our special guest, our speaker today. We have Dr. Glory Emmanuel-Aviña. She is a quantitative psychologist at Sandia National Labs, located at the Livermore, California location. She has a PhD in experimental psychology and an MBA in international management from the University of San Diego. She has been at Sandia since 2006, and she is the lead on the Wearables at the Canyon for Health project, which is funded by Ditcher, as I mentioned. So we want to thank you, Glory, for offering your time and your expertise today. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Greg, and thanks HDIAC as well for this opportunity, as well as everyone on the line. I hope we'll get to have good questions at the end and some discussion. So I'm going to be talking about wearable technology research for the DoD. As Greg was mentioning, it's a booming area, and it's one that's touched on different areas in the DoD, especially with our military population. And so I'm going to go into this more during the talk, but there is human subjects research for wearable technologies, especially looking at human performance labs. And data that can be collected within these labs can be collected through sensors that are on wearable technologies. This can be non-invasive devices that you wear, like smartwatches, chest straps. There's also a lot of growth in smart clothing, more because it's integrated with human activity. A big area that I'm interested in is neurocognitive data. That's something that I'll be talking heavily about because of how it further promotes quantifying human performance. And then also the management of wearable data. When we're collecting all of this data, how do we analyze it so that it helps us make good decisions, better decisions, but also how do we protect that data, especially with the recent incident that Greg mentioned with Strava. So first, I'm going to give a brief introduction to Sandia National Labs, because I think tying that mission to that research really helps to also discuss the underlying area of wearable technologies with the DoD. So Sandia National Labs is a Department of Energy federally funded research and development center working on national security problems. Just a little bit of history. It first started its work in the 1940s during the Manhattan Project as a nuclear weapons engineering lab, working on the first atomic bomb. But Sandia's portfolio has evolved and become much more diverse since then. We still have a core mission area in nuclear weapons, but we also work in energy, serving the Department of Defense and our military, as well as in global security problems. So what you see on this first slide is an example of our energy portfolio. We have a number of sponsored program level efforts that have resulted in progress, significant progress in renewable and fossil energy, electrical grid, and integration and resiliency, as well as integration of stored renewable energy. We focus on safety and security of nuclear power systems, nuclear waste management, and we're passionate about cleaner and more efficient vehicle technologies, as well as energy efficiency and solid-state lighting and innovative semiconductors. We also have a core mission area in global and homeland security, and this mission area really focuses on trying to stay ahead of the threat. So one of our main sponsors for global security is the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, where we work to prevent the misuse of nuclear, chemical, biological, and radiological materials. We also work on satellites, homeland defense, force protection, and counterterrorism, but I wanted to highlight the chem-bio focus specifically for this talk. And we also care about the protection of data through cyber and infrastructure security, really ensuring that the data that's being collected through different data streams is properly protected as well as properly accessed. So those are our Sandia's core mission areas, but as an R&D lab, the mission support really can't happen without good science. So we have 7 research foundations that are critical to supporting our security mission areas. We have computing and information sciences. That area works on building increasingly accurate predictive models and delivering reliable science and engineering results. Mainly, we focus the advancement of the state of art in math, computing, and cybersecurity. We also work on engineering sciences, and that involves the development and utilization of theory, experimental diagnostics, computational modeling to improve systems that support national security. We focus on geosciences. That's developing a deep understanding of the earth and atmospheric sciences to solve problems in areas such as energy security, defense, nuclear weapons, non-proliferation, disaster response, climate security. We also work in material sciences that focuses on analyzing materials and creating new classes of materials, and that can include stainless steels, carbon composites, ceramics, polymers, new materials. We work on nanodevices and microsystems to study physical phenomena across the nano and microscales, and then radiation effects in high energy density sciences. And the reason I wanted to give that brief overview is because it feeds directly in today's topic, which is wearable technologies for the Department of Defense. We have a mission need to quantify human performance. We need to understand human performance so we can protect, maintain, and enhance our military performance, both in training events as well as in the field. But to accomplish that mission, we really need good research to understand, for example, how bioscience can quantify markers of human performance, or with microsystems, how we can develop good wearable sensors, as well as make them small and able to collect good data when we're performing physical activities. We need good computing and information science so that we can help analyze the data from wearables, especially in real time, not just looking at events that have happened in the past. So I want to connect that to the problem with chem-bio threats. This table, it's available on the open web, and I just want to use it as an example to hit on a few key points. So overall, wearable technologies can be used to help detect chemical and biological threats, and hopefully with enough warning that it protects military and civilian populations against harm. But from this table, we can take away a few points. One is that chem-bio attacks continue to happen against military and civilian populations, but they're also not a daily occurrence. So we need to pick out the signal of chem-bio threats compared to just normal health events that can happen just when operating in extreme or harsh environments. And that people who are affected by exposures can have the same symptoms as those who are experiencing fatigue, and again, other health events. So the goal is really to use wearable technologies to detect chem-bio exposures, but we need to do the research to understand how we can do that. So to give just a brief outline of the topic areas I want to hit on for this talk, I want to talk about just how wearables need to be able to withstand extreme environments. I think there's a lot of attention on wearables, but a lot of the times it's based on just normal physical activity. The right data needs to be collected. Wearables need to be able to provide useful data. Data needs to differentiate between physical fatigue, health, and chem-bio exposures, and I'll talk about ways that we're able to do that. And data needs to be processed and analyzed in real time. So let's start with wearables need to be able to withstand extreme environments. So as you know, there's a boom in wearable devices. There's so many commercial off-the-shelf devices that are readily available, and the landscape is always changing. New devices are regularly added to the market every day. Sports watches, chest straps, GPS trackers, those are typically used for physical activities such as going on runs, hikes. The focus is on bettering our ability to be physically active. There are pulse oximeters and the like to gauge oxygen levels. A lot of devices in that category are also used in health environments. Wearable and temporary tattoos, that's kind of a new and innovative area because it helps to keep devices from being bulky and added weight. They are also used to measure heart and cognitive features. And that is especially useful when you want to be agile in an environment and you're already carrying a lot of weight. Electromagnetic generators, not necessarily a wearable device, but speaks to the need for power supplies for wearables. And then smart clothing, again, that's just a growing area because you don't need to add anything to the activity you're already doing. You don't need to put on a device. You don't need to put on a chest strap. It's collecting data from just by wearing through the clothes that you're already wearing. So again, advances are continually being made, but they're not usually focused on extreme environments, and I want to touch more on that topic. So if you think about the physical environments that are where our warfighters are in, wearable devices need to be able to operate in rough conditions. For warfighters wearing devices along with a lot of gear, devices need to fit properly and not impede movements. Devices need to be able to connect to a signal to export data, but that signal might not always be available, even though devices usually connect to one another. So if you're wearing a chest strap, the data that's being collected might be connected to a watch, for example, or your phone. And battery life is a big issue, especially when you don't have readily access to a power supply source. So you're relying on your devices to last for a long time, even though you don't have the ability to charge them readily. The data that's collected needs to be valid and worthwhile. The device itself needs to last. So if you remember back the days when we had flip phones and phones that would just last for a long time, now because devices are becoming more complex, there are a lot of features that can go out easily. And so that can be an issue when you're relying on that data. So another example is that if you don't charge a smartwatch, for example, on a regular basis, the battery will shortage and that device will die out. We've had that experience in our own studies. And that doesn't work in when just managing devices. So other ways devices need to last is in harsh temperatures. Sometimes touchscreens won't work in really cold or really hot temperatures. Dirt, grit, water, etc. may frequently come in contact with devices and may mess up their functioning. And the ability to operate in extreme altitudes. So we've gone to the Grand Canyon. I'll talk about that project later. And there are a lot of switchbacks. So if you're using GPS data to gauge how much water you're going to intake while you're out in the terrain and it's off by 5 miles or 10 miles or 20 miles, then you might be running out of water before you get to the end, which it causes a health risk. And again, limited or no network connectivity as well as limited power sources can impact the functionality of your devices. So now I want to talk about just how the right data needs to be collected. You can have devices that are made really well and easy to operate, but if they aren't giving you the data that is accurate or speaks to the activity that you're doing, then there's really no point in using them. So going back to one of the main research goals, our desire is to quantify performance. We want to know what specific markers contribute to knowing a person is in good shape, that they're ready to go. And then in contrast, which markers are related to showing that a person is declining in health and performance. And not that they're just declining, but also why are they declining. So wearable devices have shown to be a great resource for that. I think that's a big reason for why they're growing in interest and use. And wearable sensors are pretty good at collecting physiological data. They're able to collect heart rate variability, breathing rate, GPS position, cadence, elevation, temperature, both with in the ambient environment as well as a human skin temperature. You can collect more information about the external environment, such with relative humidity. Sleep is another area that's gaining a lot more attention, both with movement as well as restlessness, the quality of sleep that someone's had at night, and that list is just continuing to grow. This is just a few examples of data that can be collected. But again, that emphasis is on physiological data, and physiological data isn't a full picture of how human performance operates. So we have a limited snapshot of human performance. One is because of sensor development. A lot of the time, the data that we collect is noisy. It's not fully accurate. It doesn't give us all the data that we need. And so better technology is needed in order to collect better data. We also need to collect different types of data. One area that I'm really interested in is neurocognitive data, which I'll talk more about in depth. But first I'm going to talk about smart clothing, since that has been such a hot topic in the wearable clothing or the smart clothing industry and in wearable technologies. So smart clothing that can just be best defined as fabrics with electronics or interconnections woven into them, and their overall function is to collect that physiological data as well as characterize the environment that the user is in. So it can look at heating and cooling and collect data on muscle movement. It can collect heart rate data, a lot of these physiological factors that we just listed out. And there are challenges and trade-offs. We have found that some are, in order to get a good read, they have to be quite fit. They're not always very flexible. They can be stiff. They can impede movement. And some of these trade-offs are not helpful for mission contexts. So if it takes a lot of power consumption, if you're not able to work well in a group, then that can really limit the use of smart clothing, even though it's a great resource. I want to touch on neurocognitive data. As Greg mentioned, I'm a quantitative psychologist by training, and so I fully believe that human performance is not just how our human body is operating, but it's also the way we're thinking and processing information. So to define neurocognitive data, that is that's data that talks about your cognitive function while performing or completing a task. So examples of that can be decision making. So you're in an environment, say a high consequence scenario, you're processing a lot of information and you need to make decisions with the information that you're given. You also need to remember information. So your short-term memory is working as well as your long-term memory to access information. You need to maintain focused attention and that alertness in order to respond to threatening stimuli that's in your environment. So when cognitive function begins to decline, there is a drop in human performance. So if we can quantify neurocognitive activity, then this will help us to better quantify overall human performance. There have been some efforts to accomplish this through wearable devices, such as eye trackers. There's the popular Google glasses, which didn't actually have as much of an impact in the wearable technology field as was originally hoped, because they added a lot of cognitive load. It was difficult to visually process information that's right in front of you in your environment, as well as process information that's being displayed on a glass in front of you. There has also been work on headsets that collect EEG or brain activity data. And those are of interest because you could quantify brain activity while performing an activity, but a lot of neurocognitive wearables are restricted in how they're able to be used. So a lot of The research is focused on lab environments as well as with gamers, because you need a very quiet environment, you need to have limited movement. So it's difficult to collect neurocognitive data when performing an actual physical activity. Okay, so now I'm going to switch from talking about devices itself as well as the data that needs to be collected to useful data. Ideally, we want wearable devices to collect data from devices, and then that data is extracted, that data is analyzed, and we're able to make decisions in mission contexts. But to accomplish this, we need to have data that measures what it says it measures. So if it's collecting cadence data, then we want to be sure that it's actually collecting someone's steps, especially if we're looking at how a person is taking rests, how often they're taking rests, how long they're taking rests. We also need to have data that tells us about human performance. We need data that is reliable. It's going to collect the same consistent data over time, and that data is able to predict events before they are severe. So now I want to go into how data needs to differentiate between physical fatigue, health events, as well as chemical and biological exposures. And this is really the heart of the talk, as well as how we go about doing this. A huge research question is how or what markers of human performance for physical fatigue and stress, or even health events related just to our human biome, how does that differ from when you are exposed to a chemical or biological agent? So you can have a health event related to physical fatigue and stress, and you can have a health event related to chemical biological exposure. And a lot of the symptoms could be the same. So you could have heat sensitivity, you could have unfocused attention, you could have tightness in your chest or coughing. You can have sensations of feeling lightheaded or feeling like you're going to faint. And we're not entirely sure what the cause of these markers are. Is it related to something that you've been exposed to, or is it just because you're fatigued and your body is in stress? So what if you could see, by collecting wearable data and processing it in real time, that instead of just one individual feeling these symptoms, that actually a whole group was affected at the same time. A whole group was starting to show these symptoms. And you would expect to see with, again, as a research topic, that change in heart rate variability, maybe you're taking more breaks or you're slowing your steps because you're fatigued. But instead, you see a more erratic change in heart rate variability, or your pace has quickened, your cadence is faster, you're taking less breaks. Maybe by a team of analysts seeing that data in real time, you would actually be able to determine that something has happened in the environment, that there could be an exposure, instead of an individual feeling physically fatigued. So there are ways that we could actually make profiles that show different markers for different scenarios. And one way is to use human subjects research to understand these differences. And human subjects research is simply when you collect data from humans in a controlled environment so that you can analyze the data and extrapolate it to real-world scenarios. Okay, so I'd like to go into a few examples of studies that are being funded by DTRA that are using human subject studies to work on wearable technologies for DoD purposes. The first one I'm going to talk about is a study that I lead called Wearables at the Canyon for Health, WATCH for short. And what this study is doing, it's gone on for about 1.5 years and is funded by DITRA's branch in chem-bio because of the desire to create what they call a null hypothesis of health events. So no human is being exposed to chem-bio exposures, but we can look to see what biomarkers are related to performance just when people are performing a very strenuous activity. So we put a suite of wearable devices on both military and civilian participants, and those participants hike the rim-to-rim hike in a single day at the Grand Canyon. And we collect data through COTS devices. So one individual will be wearing a foot pod, a smartwatch, a chest strap. We've used hats, smart hats. We've used smart clothing. They'll also use a device that measures ambient temperature as well as skin temperature. And through these devices, we also work alongside the University of New Mexico to collect blood work. And what is a unique part of the study is we collect cognitive data, but that's through a short cognitive brain game that hikers will take every 5 miles. It's not something that we can collect in real time due to the limitations in wearable technology. So in the study, we're able to look at how devices hold up in extreme environments. A lot of the time, they might not make it the whole hike because it is takes hikers about 12 to 14 hours to complete. But because we know you're going to get physically fatigued during the hike, we're also able to develop predictive statistical models to predict when fatigue will occur based on not just physiological data, but also cognitive and biomarkers. So we also have learned about a study that's going on at the Naval Warfare Center. And I think Laura might be a participant on this, so I'll always pass it off to her if she wants to add anything at the end. But this is through the Dahlgren Division, and there's a goal to establish a baseline of physiological patterns and then to see how that baseline is impacted by folks who are sick with a virus or a bacterial infection. And to date, they've collected data through numerous COTS devices. They've also evaluated data that's come from these devices using a small cohort of volunteers. And they're looking at operational criteria. So they're looking at the security of PII that's on these devices, robustness, performance of the device, data security controls, and reliability in monitoring and recording physiological parameters of interest. They're also working on the data analysis part by developing statistical algorithms to analyze subject time series data. And the algorithms are focusing on how sleep can be monitored, how heart rate over interval data can be analyzed, and creating a baseline for when someone is sick and when they're not sick. Another example of a human subject study that's ongoing is collecting biofluids through microneedles and advancing microneedles so they can be used as a wearable technology. So as I mentioned, in the WATCH study, we're collecting blood work, but that's a very invasive process. So before a hiker goes on the hike and then after a hiker goes on the hike, we have to do a blood draw. So they have to go into a tent. We collect a couple teaspoons of blood. And again, this data has to be processed and analyzed in a lab, and it's analyzed after a person has completed an activity. But it would be extremely helpful to be able to collect biological fluids and analyze that data in real time. So biological fluids can be sweat, interstitial fluid, which is known as ISF. That's fluid that's right under the layer of your skin. And microneedles have been developed so that you can wear them almost like a Band-Aid, and they lightly penetrate the skin, and using two-way needles they can withdraw some of that interstitial fluid. And the research that's being done currently is to see what markers are both in blood work data as well as in ISF and other biological fluids, so that you don't have to collect blood work, you can just collect biological fluids in non-invasive manners. So this would help if you're, for example, losing a lot of salt, which is typically measured through blood work data. Instead, you could look at that through ISF, and losing a lot of salt is a huge issue in very hot temperatures because it can lead to a stroke, it can lead to hyponatremia. Both can have fatal consequences, but a microneedle sensor could ideally pick that up, and you could see that that phenomenon is happening before it's fatal. So this is again in early stages of development, but the goal is to move it to real-time monitoring. Another goal would be to make microneedles two-way, so that not only are you able to collect data, but you could also provide some sort of therapeutic once you know that something has happened using a two-way needle system. Finally, I want to talk about how data needs to be processed and analyzed in real time. So big data is a term that's been thrown around quite a bit. Just that we have a lot of data and we need to know how to analyze it. Traditionally, data is collected and analyzed immediately after an activity has been done, sometimes not even immediately, but after a while. And so in order to enable analysts or folks who are working alongside our military, we need to be able to analyze data while warfighters are in the field, and that will help us to be able to anticipate, predict, and avoid declines in human performance. So there's been one effort by MIT Lincoln Labs. They've developed an algorithm called Presaged, which uses real-time physiological data to predict the probability that a person was exposed to a pathogen. And they've taken this algorithm and they've applied it to non-human populations and primates. But what we really need are predictive models for military personnel in extreme environments. So on the slide on the far right-hand side at the bottom, that is a platform DTRA has a biosurveillance ecosystem, the BSVE, and PNNL, the Pacific Northwest National Lab, developed a dashboard which is used to display some data from physiological wearable devices. And the goal is for an analyst to be able to look at data and say, okay, this individual is being affected in this way, or their health performance is on track. But maybe over time, suddenly they start to see a change, and wearable devices are showing that this person is now declining in human performance. Can an analyst say why that's happening? Can it inform a decision maker about what to do? And then if you can take that individual data and then show group data, that could help to say, okay, how is the overall performance of this group doing? Are they still on track to be able to meet a mission goal? But fusing data streams can be very difficult, especially when you're collecting data from a number of different devices. So data fusing, data extracting, data analyzing, these are all big data problems that needs to be addressed in the research world, especially through predictive analytics and algorithm development. So to connect the research back to the mission goals, we need to be able to use wearable technologies to help analysts make good decisions about warfighters in DoD mission contexts. One thing that we've learned from working alongside our military populations is that they don't necessarily have the bandwidth to keep their attention on the mission as well as keep their attention on their own individual human performance. It would be great if a team of analysts working alongside our military could be doing the work for them in terms of monitoring human performance so that our military can just continue to keep their mind on the mission and their focus on that. So just to go to conclusion and next steps, overall, these 5 points are active research goals and missions, and I could probably give a long talk about each of these areas. So this is just really an overview about the challenges as well as the opportunities that wearables have for each of these areas. So wearables need to be able to withstand extreme environments. There are challenges with temperature and environmental elements, network connectivity, and they really need to be approached holistically in order to find solutions. The right data also needs to be collected. We can't just take a snapshot of human performance after an activity, but it needs to be collected in real time. It's just not a piece of human performance that we're interested in, but holistically looking at a person's physiology, biology, and cognitive. Wearables need to be able to provide useful data. So again, reliable, validated, and it accurately captures performance, human performance. Data needs to differentiate between physical fatigue and chem-bio exposures, and human subject studies is a great way to do that. And data also needs to be processed and analyzed in real time. So building statistical models that are predictive of human performance, that algorithm development just can't be left behind. For next steps, we need to keep improving wearable technologies. And we also need to continue to improve human subjects research. So sometimes with human subjects research, we can have confounds in our data. It can be collected in training environments, but a lot of the environment isn't controlled, so you can't make good conclusions out of that data. And instead of a lab environment, doing activities like a rim-to-rim hike where you know that your humans or your participants are experiencing extreme fatigue, or they are like with the Naval Warfare Center, they're actually collecting data from folks who've been exposed to a virus or bacterial infection. So collecting data that is close to the context that we're applying them to. And then improving the usefulness of that data. So once we do the research, just making sure that we connect it to the mission environment. And again, not thinking about wearable technologies just as what can be done on normal physical activity, but what does it mean to collect data in extreme environments? And then making it more embedded into the human biome. Working with our military, they don't have a lot of extra weight to carry, and nor do they need to be any more constrained, and so making it very applicable to their setting. And then using multiple data streams, so physiological, cognitive, biological data, being able to implement those data streams into wearable technologies. So I hope that was a helpful overview. I wanted to leave enough time for questions and discussions and comments. And at this time, I'll turn it back over to Greg.
Thank you, Glory. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today and to give this presentation. It was very well thought out, very well delivered. So we thank you for your time. We do have a question that I think I'll just open up, and then I've got one of my own. So this one's from Joni Jackman, and she asked about exhale breath condensate. So did you want to take them on, Glory, and maybe talk about your thoughts on how some of those things may be able to be measured and incorporated into some monitoring?
Yeah, I would like to learn more about that. That's not an area that I'm very familiar with. I think when I think about EBC, that's, if I'm not mistaken, and Joni, I'd be interested in hearing more from you about this, but it's a matrix of biomarkers and can be equivalent to biological fluids like sweat and tears and saliva. And so it seems like it's an interesting research area and one that could further talk about could be used for human performance.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Sounds like Joni agrees with you. I know in the occupational space, there's been a lot of discussion as to whether you could use the EBCs for monitoring some advanced material exposures and other sorts of conditions. So, yeah, that'd be interesting. Maybe, Joni, we can follow back with you at a later date. So we've got a question from Jim McKnight about cognition.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So let me talk about how we've been measuring it currently, and then we can go from there. So one thing that we're doing is we have a cognitive battery that we put on an iPod Touch, and it has 3 cognitive measures. So they're essentially brain games is what we like to call it. One presents simple as well as complex stimuli, and a participant has to respond about whether the right or wrong, actually better congruent or incongruent stimuli is being presented. And another task is looking at visual short-term memory. So they're presented with a series of colored boxes, and then they have to remember that. Then they're presented with just one box, and they have to remember if that box was the same color as was presented in a series of boxes in the previous trial. And so we're looking to see, and then another one is participants are asked to respond a certain way, and they have to inhibit a response from touching the iPod screen. I know those aren't great descriptions. Happy to send slides with more information or more visuals on those apps. But we're looking at accuracy and reaction time to see if that's inhibited by performance. That, again, all of our participants have to stop and take that cognitive battery along the way. It would be, and the goal is to measure focused attention, short-term memory, some of these cognitive attributes. But it would be nice if folks didn't have to stop to complete a battery, that somehow we were able to put an EEG headset on someone that is non-invasive, and we're able to collect data on brain activity. One military person once said to me, "Are you able to open up my head and put a device in there to measure my brain so I don't have to deal with any external measure?"
So I actually want to comment on that. I believe that's already been done, where a neurosurgeon says that the chip can be implanted in somebody's brain to monitor things. So that may be kind of the next phase of things, coupled with some of the comments that Elon Musk has made about kind of the interface of electronics and human beings to keep up with some of these advances in artificial intelligence and stuff. So I would get to a couple questions here. The chat's moving a little bit faster than we are, I think. So two questions from Pradeep. I'll take the first one, and then Gloria, if you want to take the second. So some of the challenges in additive printed electronics. I think first of all, the cost, right? The cost to market. A lot of these things are in the R&D stages right now, so figuring out how you're going to make them scalable and cost effective. I think looking at the materials in general, there's been a lot of advances now in the metal printing. So I think that's going to make the electronics and the integrated circuits easier to print than they have been before. So I think once we can kind of figure out some of those challenges, and then also I just think figuring out if that's going to actually be better to 3D print something than to just use traditional methods. So Gloria, if you wanted to take the second question about the failure mechanisms in the watch.
Yep. So what are the leading failure mechanisms in the watch environment? Battery life is a huge one. It is difficult to get a device that collects as much data as you want, but also lasts more than 12 hours. So that's probably our biggest one. Another one actually is just human error. So folks will, we tell our participants not to interact with the devices because an example is one person was using the GPS to schedule their water breaks, and in reality the GPS was off. It was off by about 5 to 6 miles, and so they ran out of water before they finished the hike. And that is mainly because of all the switchbacks. Another one is the network connectivity. There really isn't any when you're at the Grand Canyon, and so especially while you're hiking, and so keeping track of folks while they're doing the hike is very difficult. Some things that we are able to do really well, the cognitive battery has worked well even though it is passive. Also being able to collect information about the external environment, that works really well. Another challenge has been just looking at rest breaks, using the cadence data to collect data on when folks are taking breaks. That is a pretty good indicator of fatigue. And so we'd like to collect better information about rest breaks that folks are taking.
So I want to address, Jim has a question, and then I think we'll try to move through. We've got a few minutes left. So Jim asked if there's anything being used in real time to monitor cognitive status. I know there's been some research in some sort of mobile EEG platform. I know that's pretty challenging because you have to have the electrodes in the right places, and then when you're dealing with environmental conditions, people are sweating, and you've got extreme heat and cold, that can be challenging. So Gloria, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is such a huge challenge. I have done EEG data collection in a controlled environment just from actually cyber defenders in a lab environment, and even that data is noisy. So anytime you get movement, and as well as the challenges that Greg you just mentioned, it's really difficult. I don't foresee anything to be deployed in the near future until we can get better sensor placement as well as connectivity.
And then Joshua, I'm not familiar with the Master E study. If anybody here is, feel free to chat. If not, perhaps we can get back to you, Joshua, about that. Gloria, are you familiar with that at all?
Let's see. I am not familiar with that.
Okay. Josh, we can follow back with you. Perhaps you can contact me if you want at the end. We'll have my contact information up. Um, okay, Jeff, DoD's position on invasive versus non-invasive. I feel like that's a loaded question, although I completely understand why you would ask that. I don't know exactly if they have a position. So that's something that I could probably do a little bit of research and get back to you on. I would imagine that they would prefer more non-invasive techniques right now just because it's easier. Obviously, there are times where you have to do invasive things like blood collection, but um, that's a question I think I could get back to you on. And then
Yeah, I
from
think
Joni's, I'm sorry, go ahead, Glory.
I was going to just add to that is I think there's that balance of collecting good data, also ethical data, and not complicated data. And so I think that's something that the DoD is always thinking about.
Yeah, and there are times where you're just going to have something like an implantable device. If you look at like continuous glucose monitoring, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and that's a completely acceptable way to monitor glucose levels in type 1 diabetics and other advanced stage diabetes. But yeah, I think you're right. I think there's going to be balance in terms of what you're trying to achieve. And then Joni, I'm not sure acceptable rate range. And what are you referring to? That may have been from an earlier discussion we had.
Mhm. I also saw, I think Dolores had a question about what are there predictive statistical models that we recommend. We're looking into the one that MIT Lincoln Labs has developed, but I sit in a data science department at Sandia, and one area that we're focusing on is just creating predictive statistical models, mainly because, or through the use of data sets like with the 3 human subject studies I mentioned. I think it's hard to get your hands on data sets that actually are measuring human performance with a number of different physiological and cognitive and biological markers.
So we are almost out of time, but I think we've got time to answer these last couple of questions here real quick, and then I've got a little bit more information about how you can further connect with HDIAC and some of the services that we offer. So just real quick, from Dolores, electronic tattoo sensors. Gloria, do you have any thoughts on that?
We haven't used electronic tattoo sensors. We're aware of them. We have a few collaborations with labs who are developing them, but nothing's been deployed in an environment where we collect human data in a real world activity.
Okay, and then I think the last question we'll take, and Gloria, do you have any experience with COS devices or sweater interstitial fluid?
Um, well, for ISF analysis, there is a recent patent that was put out through a collaboration between the University of New Mexico and Sandia on developing a 2-way microneedle patch, and that the patent is out, but I don't believe that's a readily available device. So I think the current state of ISF analysis is that the devices are being developed. There's another company that I can't remember off the top of my head. I'll have to dig deeper into that, that I think would be recommended for ISF. And preference for ISF over sweat, definitely.
All right, I think we're going to have to wrap things up for today. I want to thank Gloria again for taking time to be on the webinar with us. If you didn't get your question answered, if you have more questions, we're going to have some contact information here at the end. You can contact us. You can contact me or Gloria directly, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. Just real quick, I want to mention a couple services that we offer with HDIAC. If you didn't have your questions answered today, you can also submit what we call a technical inquiry. You can go online and do this. We provided the 4 hours of free information services for you as long as it fits within one of our focus areas. So obviously the topic of today's discussion would be covered by that. So this is a great way if you have questions and need a little bit more technical information, we can help you out with that. If the 4 free hours that we provide doesn't quite answer your question, or there's a much larger project you're interested in funding or supporting or working with us on, you can utilize our core analysis task. This is a way that we can support research and development within the defense community as well as other areas of federal government. So as a pre-awarded, competed vehicle, we currently have a cap of $500,000, and then projects have to be completed in less than 12 months. So if you're interested in that, you can, again, contact me directly or also go on our website and find out more information. So I want to thank everybody again. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We will have this presentation available for download here, I think momentarily. No? Okay, tomorrow. It's going to be available on our website tomorrow, HDIAC.org, and we'll also have it on our social media sites. And if anybody's interested in joining our subject matter expert community, please go to the website and sign up. And if you're interested in giving a webinar through the HDIAC platform, please reach out to us and we can get you on our network. And okay, and the slide deck is available for download as well. So we'll leave that up for a few minutes. Again, we want to thank everybody for joining and hope you have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.